Good morning, everybody. Welcome. Thank you very much for struggling to join here. We know how difficult it is during the AU Summit, to move around Addis Ababa. So we are very grateful that you are able to make it here. My name is Desiree Asogbavi, and I'm an advisor at the Open Society Foundation, based in Senegal in Dakar. And I'm always so glad to come back home here in Ethiopia, where a good part of my life has been spent. I'm happy to see old and new friends here, and thank you for coming. So today we are here to do what we are calling citizen dialogue on human rights, justice, governance, and peace in Africa. And during the discussion yesterday, somebody asked me, are you doing a side meeting? I said, no, our discussion is not a side meeting to the AU Summit. We're here to discuss serious matter on how we can contribute in fixing our continent. So we are not on the side. We are in the game, actually. So the discussion today is part of the game for the continent to be a better place to live for ourselves and for the future generation to come. So we know that we spend a lot of time before starting for obvious reasons, so we're not going to waste more time. Let me just tell you what the program looks like. We're going to have a few remarks by the organizers, and let me use the opportunity to thank strongly our partners that actually joined us to organize this, starting by our host, Amani Africa, our longtime comrades in crime. Thank you very much, Amani team, who put everything together for us. I was just telling Solomon that they dominate the land, and we are very proud of them. Thank you very much to PALU, the Pan-Africa Lawyers Union, with whom we have a long history. Thank you, Don and team, Ruth, for supporting, the setting up of this gathering. We thanks strongly, I don't know how we call them, we are part of them, actually, our friend from the ECOSOC. ECOSOC, the team of ECOSOC has been shaking, things in Africa. We're just telling William how much we are proud of the team for what they are doing, mobilizing voices different from the policymakers, but bringing those voices within the policy discussions, and they never stop. We see them. William, thank you for being around all the time that we want you, and thank you for showing up, despite the fact that you're supposed to be in the Executive Council. So let me go ahead and invite the first speaker, who is going to be the representative of Amani Africa. The first chef, Hailu. I hope I pronounce your name very well. Let me give you the floor, to welcome us before we get to the game. Thank you.
Thank you, Desiree. I'm used to getting my name crucified.
I'll study.
No worries. My name is Tafsirat Hailu. I'm a senior researcher at Amani Africa. You can call me Taifi. I know my name is a bit hard to pronounce. I would like to thank you all for your patience. These times are hard to move around, so we had to wait all participants to come in because of the roads. Distinguished guests, colleagues, partners, and friends, on behalf of Amani Africa, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the Citizens Dialogue Convent in partnership with our partners, Open Society Foundation, the Pan-African Lawyers Union, and the ECOSOC. We meet at a moment of profound consequence for our continent, a moment defined not by a single crisis, but by the convergence of multiple and mutually reinforcing pressure on governance, peace, justice, and human rights. From Amani Africa's continuous monitoring of peace and security trends across the continent, one reality stands out with stark clarity. Africa is entering what we have described in last year's publication that we published around the summit, a new era of instability and insecurity. This is not merely about the persistence of conflicts in the continent. What's most concerning today is their normalization, entrenchment, and systemic spillover into governance and human rights spaces. Across the continent, conflicts have not only intensified, but they have also expanded geographically, become more complex, and increasingly internationalized. From Sudan to Eastern DRC, from the Sahel to parts of Horn of Africa, armed violence has escalated, territorial control has shifted repeatedly, and humanitarian suffering has reached historic proportions. Today, Africa hosts some of the world's largest humanitarian emergencies. Sudan alone has become the world's largest hunger, displacement, and protection crisis, with over 30 million historic proportions. In Eastern DRC, more than 2 million people were newly displaced in a single year, illustrating the scale and acceleration of instability. But what is equally alarming is that this situation is increasingly treated as routine. Conflicts that were once expected to be temporary have become entrenched. Emergency measures introduced as exceptional responses are being permanent tools of governance. Civic restrictions, once treated as alarming, are increasingly routine, and accountability gaps are widening across multiple contexts. For example, if we see the last year, the Sudan conflict, we thought, although the African Union AU-led mediation efforts were not involved actively in the process, we hoped that the conflict would be resolved. But what we saw is the intensifying of the conflict. In March 2025, the conflict intensified and the SAF controlled Khartoum. Then, in October, we saw the incident of El Fasher. Then in December, we saw again the conflict intensified and RSF controlling the SAF military base in Cordova. I don't want to get into the details of the conflict, but I want to emphasize how much the conflicts have been intensified in the past year. So, as global conflict data shows, high levels of armed violence are becoming the new normal globally, and Africa is deeply affected by this trend. Yet, our reflection on the challenge is not only about armed conflicts. This is happening within a rapidly changing global environment. The weakening of multilateral norms and intensifying geopolitical competition have altered how conflicts are addressed. Instead of sustained political settlements, we're increasingly seeing transactional ceasefire diplomacy, short-term stabilization approach, and declining international consensus on accountability and human rights. In this context, Africa is facing what we might call a double strain: pressure from within, governance deficits, shrinking civic space, and legitimacy crisis, and pressure from outside, as a global order that once supported multilateral solution becomes more fragmented and unpredictable. At Amani Africa, our analysis consistently shows that governance erosion is now one of the most significant drivers of insecurity. Across multiple regions, we see patterns that are deeply troubling: the shrinking of civic space, the routine use of emergency measures, manipulation of constitutional processes, democratic regression, and electoral violence. growing militarization of political power. These are not isolated developments. They are increasingly becoming structural features of governance systems, and when governance loses legitimacy, peace becomes fragile. Indeed, one of the defining characteristics of current moment is that human rights violations, governance failures, and conflict dynamics are no longer separate phenomena. They are deeply interconnected. Another key trend emerging from Amani Africa's work is a growing strain on Africa's multilateral institutions. At precisely the time when the continent most needs collective action, confidence in multilateral mechanisms has weakened due to underfunding, inconsistent enforcement, political divisions, and external bypassing. We're witnessing preventive diplomacy struggling to keep pace with crisis, peace processes increasingly displaced by external actors, AU mechanisms facing enforcement and compliance gaps. This institutional strain raises a critical question. How do we safeguard Africa's normative frameworks, not only in principle, but in practice? This is precisely why today's dialogue is so timely and necessary. Because the greatest risk we face is not only the existence of violations, it's their normalization. When repression becomes politically tolerated, when constitutional breaches become negotiable, when accountability becomes selective, we do not simply lose rights. We lose legitimacy, stability, and ultimately peace itself. One of the core lessons from our publications and research work is that sustainable peace cannot be built without legitimate governance. Legitimate governance cannot exist without justice and accountability, and none of these are possible without protecting human rights and civic participation. These are not parallel agendas. They are mutually reinforcing pillars of Africa's stability and future. And at the center of all of them must be the African citizen. So, as the African Union continues its important processes, including the review of the African peace and security architecture, this is a critical moment to ask, how do we close enforcement gaps in our human rights and governance frameworks? How do we strengthen peer accountability among member states? How do we restore trust between institutions and citizens? And how do we ensure that Africa's normative commitments translate into lived realities? Today's dialogue provides an important platform to confront these questions, honestly, collectively, and constructively. At Amani Africa, we are deeply committed to ensuring the evidence-based analysis, citizen voices, and policy engagement continue to inform continental decision-making. We therefore look forward to a rich exchange of perspectives and actionable recommendations that can help strengthen Africa's governance, justice, human rights, and peace architecture. Thank you. I wish us all a productive discussion and engagement. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tefi. I think it's better to call you that way so I don't massacre your name again. Thank you very much for your very deep remarks. And we will go in the working group later to look more deeply in some of those issues that Tefi mentions in her remarks. The economic, social, and cultural councils of ECOSOC, of the AU. ECOSOC is that branch of the AU, that organ that has a mandate to be the bridge between official policymakers and civil society at large. And we have seen them in action. They need to make sure that citizens' voices are heard before the final decisions are made within the African Union. And I'm glad that they are here as participants of this discussion, because we just don't want to talk to ourselves. We really want that the conclusions that we'll be putting together become strong recommendations that made it somehow through decisions, not just around the summit, but even post-summit. That's why we try to collect some of the most crucial issues that the continent is facing now. And I'm glad to have the Secretary General of ECOSOC here, and I saw some other member of his team, and I'm so grateful for them to be here, because then their presence shows us that we would not talk to ourselves. Whatever we conclude, our deliberation will make their way to the policy making table. William, thank you very much for making it. I want to give you the floor, so you tell us how do you see those issues making their way to policymakers, but also give us some updates on your role in making sure that citizens are part of the African we want. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Big Chief. Let me take the opportunity to acknowledge all my senior comrades. I don't want to mention names so that I don't end up finding myself in problems. So it is good to put it in general. All senior comrades, they know themselves. And colleagues from the civil society fraternity, good morning and welcome. I have been on a roller coaster this week, delivering remarks in several civil society engagements. Indeed, it has been tiring, but equally satisfying to witness the enthusiasm and the unifying power of civil society, and we still have a long way to go. Let me be candid. I have been coming to the AU Summit for almost a decade or plus, but I can tell you without exaggeration, I have never seen anything like what we have built together this week. Not just the dialogue, but the entire ecosystem of civil society engagement we have created together. The high-level dialogues, the women platforms, the sector-specific dialogues, we have literally transformed how civil society show up at the African Union Summit. And off the record, though I know the charter rules don't really exist in practice, I think civil society engagement around the summit have somehow made the summit itself pale in comparison. Colleagues, let me speak very candidly about why we are here today, specifically focusing on human rights, justice, governance, and peace. These are not just bureaucratic themes we picked from our heart. These are lived realities that keep African mothers awake at night, wondering if their children will have justice. These are questions that young Africans ask when they see their votes stolen or their voices silenced. These are the foundations that determine whether our continent builds lasting prosperity or cycle through the endless crisis that we have been witnessing. Before it skips my mind, I want to take a moment to thank our partners in this endeavor, and I mean genuinely thanking you, not just ceremonially. Amani Africa brings something we desperately need: evidence. Not opinions, not assumptions, but rigorous research that holds power accountable and gives our advocacy credibility. Open Society Foundation has stood by African civil society when standing by us wasn't fashionable at all or easy. They understand that democracy isn't a Western export. It is an African necessity. And Palu reminds us that our advocacy must be anchored in law, in constitution, in the legal frameworks that protect citizens from arbitrary power. Working with this organization isn't just a collaboration. It is a proof that when we pool our strength, we become formidable. For today, I have been tasked to speak on the role of citizens and CSOs in African reform. I was wondering whether I even need to tell you what your role in Africa reform is. How can there be any reform with you without the citizen? So allow me to skip delving into this topic, but speak candidly and just share a few perspectives from my heart. Let me provoke you all. Do civil society actually operate in some neutral, independent space above politics? Yes or no? You like it or not, everything is political. When you document a human rights violation, that is political. When you monitor an election, that is political. When you advocate for constitutional change, that is deeply political. So arguably, I didn't ask the right question. I don't think I asked the right question. The proper question will have been, are we strategic enough to translate our political engagement into actual power shift? Because honestly, here what I have observed, African civil society have some exceptionally good, or we are exceptionally good at moral witness. We document, we demand, and yes, these are matters, but what is beyond this? Colleagues, real reforms happen when moral authority combines with strategic power. When civil society doesn't just expose corruption, but makes corruption politically costly. When we don't just demand justice, but make injustice unsustainable for those who perpetuate it. Your role in African reform isn't to stay clean and independent. It is to get strategically involved in ways that shift power towards accountability. We spend a lot of time demanding government accountability. We hold civil society, but who holds civil society accountable? When CSO advocacy fails, when our strategies don't work, when we waste donor money on ineffective programs, who calls us to account? Too often, civil society accountability runs vertically to donors, not horizontally to the communities we claim to serve. And my apology if I am too blunt or undiplomatic on this, but generally our accountability goes to donors first, and then the actual community that we serve. I want to conclude with just a few questions. The question for this dialogue isn't what role civil society should play in African reform. The question is whether we have the courage to claim the role that history demands of us. Today, we are not betting on partnerships with power. We are betting on the power of organized citizens for forced accountability for those who govern us. And there's a lot going on in terms of the African Union reform itself. Yesterday in the hall, we saw issues related to staffing and institutional capacity and the likes. And there are several questions that both citizens and member states are asking. And I think we have a fundamental role as civil society to be part of that conversation so that whatever outcome that we will get, it should not be a member state-driven outcome, but an outcome that is in partnership with the citizen so that we are able to address a critical issue. In the interest of time, let me stop here, but to thank you for being part of this. Thank you for refusing to accept that Africa's future should not be decided without Africa's people. I think we should be at the center and we should take leadership and ownership of issues that affect Africa. I will end my reflection here and I will participate actively in the group conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, William Karu. And I think Desiree already stressed this enough that it means so much to us that, ECOSOC is adequately represented here. And I think this discussion and this dialogue would benefit greatly from your presence and that of your colleagues who are here. So we're looking forward to having you over the next few hours. So very quickly, so my name is Ruth Osaretin Ogbewekon. I'm an officer with the Pan-African Lawyers Union based in Arusha, Tanzania, and we'll be facilitating this dialogue along with our colleague Desiree. And I think, so we're moving really quickly, and Desiree has given me the very interesting task of introducing this keynote speaker, whose CV, I think, is as long as That's a PhD thesis, but I will do my best. And so the keynote address really is meant to kind of set the pace and set the tone for the conversations that we would be having in the 3 different thematic areas today. And, we have with us here Brian Kagoro, who is the Managing Director of Programs at the Open Society Foundations. And he's a Pan-Africanist, one of the leading and favorite Pan-Africanists in this era. And I will say, if you don't follow him on social media, you probably should, because, you definitely will get some inspiration for a bigger and better Africa. And, as Paolo, I should also sneak in that we like to claim that he's a lawyer, even if he said he left legal practice behind. But, we still claim that, and we're happy to claim that. And I'm going to let him speak for himself, because honestly, you should just hear him speak, and then we will take it from there. So, Brian, welcome.
I could tell she was being naughty. She knows not to do that. The introduction should simply be Brian. Everything else doesn't matter. Friends, okay, I each time I would wear my hat in Ethiopia, people would think there's a funeral, so I'll take it off, especially the black hat. A friend of mine sent me something this morning, and I think it's taken from Instagram. Allow me to read it, and then I can talk about the speech that Desiree said I should speak. He wrote everything, so anything I say, blame Desiree. So let me read. It's from African Archives on Instagram. In 1837, Nana Badu Bonsu II, the powerful Ghanaian king of the Ahanta people, rose in open rebellion against the Dutch colonial government of the Gold Coast. His resistance was sparked by years of tension, broken agreements, growing foreign interference in Ahanta sovereignty. When Dutch officials attempted to assert greater control over his territory, the conflict escalated violently, leading to the killing of several Dutch officers. The colonial authorities responded with brutal force. Nana Badu Bonsu II was captured, put on trial by the Dutch, and sentenced to death for murder. He was publicly hanged, marking a grim moment in the history of colonial repression in West Africa. However, the violence did not end with his execution. In a final act of desecration, a Dutch surgeon severed the king's head from his body, reducing a revered African ruler to a specimen. Reducing a revered African ruler to a specimen. The head was transported to the Netherlands, where it entered the world of colonial science and racial experimentation. Preserved in a jar for formaldehyde, it was used for so-called scientific studies that sought to justify European superiority. Over time, the head was misplaced. There are 2 facts I want to play on here. First one, please remember the head was severed. The second one, remember the head was misplaced. Over time, the head was misplaced, forgotten within museum storage, and effectively erased from public memory for more than a century. There's a lot more that's in that story. And when we get some other time to talk about the theme of the year, I will refer to why I'm reading the story. Friends, colleagues, comrades, this is not a routine meeting where we're doing what civil society does, meet, have some deliberations. We're meeting at a consequential institutional moment for our continent. The global trends that have happened have upended all the things that we believed in ways that may be traumatic to some, challenging to others, and inspiring to others. Classically, we would look to those parts of the world that we believed to be developed for modeling on normative, ethical, strong institutional governance. At least we believed that the veneer of stability that colonial extraction and chattel enslavement had provided them with a head start to develop their economies, develop their institutions, and to do so in ways that you could solve for local problems using foreign cheap goods. But that myth is unraveling. Whether you are sitting in Europe or you are in the United States or you are in Russia or other parts of the so-called developed world. But it is not unraveling alone. In the moment leading up to the decolonization struggles, it had set up an international architecture, an international architecture founded on international humanitarian law and international human rights law, values it had espoused as universal, indivisible, values that were thought to exclude the possibility of people using the logic of who has the biggest stick or the largest stone to settle questions of governance and of dispute. I'm afraid to say that politically speaking, we're back in the Stone Age. And the idea of violence and force being the mediator in human relations has been centered squarely. We're also tragically back into the logic of chattel enslavement and the colonial moment, where hyper-transactionalism determines both foreign policy and bilateral and trade relations, especially with respect to critical minerals. In essence, we have now returned to a space where we are potentially the hunted, the colonized, or the enslaved. And the beauty pageantry of which country will get which tax rebates or which tariffs or which country will be welcomed to which blue, black, green, white, pink house, that beauty pageantry where Africans are competing to be acceptable, takes us back to that moment during colonization where various cohorts of slaves were competing to convert to Christianity, or the approximation of a standard assumed to be civility, notwithstanding the disproportionate amounts of violence through which this civilization came. This enlightenment came with blood. This enlightenment came with theft. This enlightenment came with lies, because you had to erase the great histories. But I'm here in Ethiopia, where the battle stopped, a potential overrun of the entire continent. It seems to me that therefore, it's not just the fact that global conflict monitoring records suggest that we had 204,000 conflict events worldwide, and with over 240,000 deaths, that by mid-2025, 117 million people globally were forcibly displaced. Folks have already referred to the Sudan, where populations the size of 5 of Southern Africa's smallest countries have been displaced out of Sudan, and for some reason, it seems normal to some. But what's curious we always assumed that we had friends in the Gulf, we had friends in the East, we had friends in various other parts of the world, because in our delusion, they were not colonizers, and therefore they understood. But alas, it really seems not to matter in this moment whether your pain emanates from your former colonizers or those who ought to be your friends. What's clear is that there are no father or mother Christmases left in the world. No one is coming to engage Africa and Africans out of benevolence. Each have their strategic self-interest. No one, not the Europeans, not our friends from the Gulf, not our friends from the East, not the Americans. No one is coming here to propound. No one is coming here to promote international values of equal humanity. Because in this pecking order of nations, although you may be repulsed by what the United States of America president said of us, it seems to permeate the thinking of some of our friends that our countries are called shithole countries. I'm sorry about using that terms. And our people are treated like people from shithole countries. So when people come to mine in our territories, they treat our environments like shithole environments. At some stage, the African has to decide whether they want to repeat chattel enslavement and colonization 2.0, or that this is a generation that's committed to liberation. At some stage, the African has to determine whether you hold to false notions of other parts of the world being more humane and yourself less humane, and they come into your territories, and in order to extract everything that will build your future or potentially build it, they give you the incentive to keep fighting based on old disagreements. So that suddenly, in 3 years, Africa, which had averted and avoided conflict, is back in conflict in almost every country. What happened in 2 years that aggravated all those grievances that had lain quiet? So it seems to me that if I were to leave you with a message, it is to understand that in part, we face both challenge and opportunity. And the challenges we face are obvious. Many speakers today will talk about them. Let me give you 2 things that animate me and 2 things that I thought to squarely put in the center of this conversation. Number 1, everything that constitutes Africa's potential to exit out of the mess that we find ourselves in. What is that everything? Our demographic dividend, right? What is that everything? Our critical minerals. What is that everything? Everything is the land, the water, the seas that we own. Everything is our dignity. But let me situate where that sits currently and why there needs to be a serious rethink. Number 1, we now have 1/3 of almost 420 million young people are either unemployed, underemployed, or discouraged. Can I repeat? If the demographic dividend, which means African youth, is our potential to get out of the mess that the elders have put us in, right? Where is the muscle for transformation? What is the positionality or the situation of young people? 1/3 of 420 million youth are either unemployed, underemployed, or discouraged. You may already know that between 10 and 12 million youth enter the labor market in Africa every year. And yet the continent has only had capacity to create 3 million jobs per annum. That means every year the reserve army of Africa's unemployed receives 7 million young people. If this is the potential, if this is the dividend, and 7 million, 7 out of 10, become unemployed, unemployable, and discouraged, then it tells you how urgent the conversation we're about to have here is. But if you look closely to that, you say, oh, the African market will solve this. Most of the most highly productive companies, private sectors in our countries are foreign owned. And our leadership is rushing to make sure almost all of it is foreign owned. Because the support for domestic, local entrepreneurship is weak. The support for rural enterprise development is weak. It almost seems that there is a beauty pageantry to describe how many people who can borrow cheaply in their jurisdictions can come and dump resources in your jurisdiction and also get away without upholding environmental standards or offering any meaningful skills and employment. No technology transfer. Essentially, no potential of achieving the right to development. Friends, there is this mismatch between the skills, the education system, and where we think we'll get transformation from. So the second is this critical minerals. Less than 3 African countries actually have a critical minerals policy. Right? It's supposed to be something that drives us. Not all African countries have ratified the Africa Mining Vision, a vision adopted in 2008. And for some reason, because they are consulting Brussels, Paris, London, Washington, they have not yet signed. Yet they come to conferences and talk about how our gold, how our rare earth minerals are going to transform us. How? There is not a single African country that can build and possess sufficient human skills and capital in order to transform its critical minerals or mining sectors alone. Regional value chain development, supply chain development, making sure that the criticality of minerals is anchored on what needs we have. We have agricultural economies. When I was growing up, my grandparents used to use a horse or ox-drawn plow. Today, after Africa has trained hundreds of thousands of engineers, people in the villages are still using what? Ox and horse-drawn plows. My friends, this is not a matter of just for us to come here and talk about, oh, we need this, we got to increase aid, US aid has exited, and etc. This is an entire reimagination of how seriously we take our own potential. I was at the mining Indaba yesterday, and I said to them, I have never seen, except for Johannesburg, critical minerals in the urban areas. They are in the rural areas, right? So if critical minerals are in the rural areas, and let me give you a stat that you will, you will find interesting. So rural youth have limited options for employment at all because many of them have no access to or are not in education. In fact, over 72 million youth are not in education, they are not in employment, and they are not in training. So there's the rhetoric that we will do in Addis. There's the reality that we must face. That in essence, if 52% of the African population is in the villages, and the villages have no form of enterprise, no form of technological, no form of training, capacity building, other than beekeeping and poverty fixing, that we have not yet brought the African rural area into the thought and into the space where there can be a source of wealth. even in a world that imports a lot of organic food brought and grown in our villages, the village still doesn't get more than 7% of the national budget. So friends, you end up with structural violence from the Sahel to northern Mozambique. You end up fixing for violence created by neglect. You end up trying to fix violence created by reckless forms of development, inappropriate, ill-targeted prioritization. We don't have a terrorism problem or violent extremism problem. The very fact that we've neglected those communities for so long, and others, both African and non-African, are accessing them and giving them false hope, is as much our fault as it is those who are interfering. And I want us to own this. Many of our NGOs actually do not operate in rural areas at all. Many of us in this room do not visit rural areas at all. In fact, the minute your parents got civilized enough to get an education, they stopped going to the rural areas. So European peace workers, Peace Corps workers or American Peace Corps workers, and soldiers from Russia and from Colombia and elsewhere have been to villages where you, with the four-wheel drives that we all drive, have never been to. And I want you to understand, because the state elite and the political elite are part of the problem, but so are we. We cannot continue to describe absolute poverty that we are unwilling to contribute a dime to, even from our salaries. So this is not for me. I didn't come here to say, oh, let's so and so is at fault. I simply came here to say, if we're going to have an honest dialogue, we have to accept that since independence, we have overlooked, ignored more than 55% of the population. Now, if you look at the situation of women in those rural areas, if you look at the situation of young people in those rural areas, the scandal of Africa's underdevelopment has been based on this false coloniality of thought and policy that pursued the development of the urban administrative center and only thought that the thing to do with mining communities and rural communities is to build a highway to enable the investor to move raw materials quickly from the poor. So, last week, Human Rights Watch suggested that we are confronted with severe human rights violations, that impunity has reached an all-time high, that the restrictions on freedom of expression, of association, of assembly, the arrest of journalists, the targeting of human rights defenders, and others, by countries that may be doing well. So human rights as a concept, human rights as a central piece of our struggle is losing grounds, not only through stolen elections, where elections have become blood sports and winner takes all, but they win by any means necessary, where authoritarians are now elected, where authoritarianism has found a way to ingratiate itself with unemployed youth, where militarization in our society has found a way to suggest to the youth that the decadence of the political elite, civilian political elite, can only be cured through military intervention. We are now at a place where not only are human rights in danger, the idea of societies where you can have open debate, open discussions, we can hold different views, is under threat, in part because people don't eat esoteric concepts of equity and equality, where in substance, they do not see the conversation over the last 6 years transformed into jobs for them, into food for them. So in essence, those of us who walk around talking human rights have become both a nuisance and an irrelevance because we have not figured out how to bring the reality of socio-economic rights to the tables, to the villages, to the spaces and places where the most discriminated and marginalized are. In fact, the human rights industry has become an employment center. Most of us in this room receive a paycheck for talking rights, justice, and equity. And there are people in villages in Mozambique, there are people in Sudan, there are people in the Sahel who don't receive a paycheck because the human rights they are defending are their very existence. Defending their land from being taken from them, defending their rivers from being polluted, defending their forests from being taken in the Congo. So now there is a disjuncture, there is a disconnect between the industry that appears on TV, the industry that's vocal and known in European and American centers, and the people who are at the coalface of the struggle for dignity, for humanity, and for human rights. And this calls for a reimagination. So the point I was making on the Sudan, 1,000 days on 9 January, Sudan in conflict. 33.7 million, nearly 2/3 of the population, now requiring humanitarian assistance. Over 20 million people needing health assistance. 21 million people face acute food insecurity. 13.6 million people are displaced, making Sudan the largest displacement crisis in the world. But the threat is not these statistics. The threat is the real danger of normalization. Normalizing the abnormal. The greatest danger before us is not only conflict, it is that normalization of the abnormal. When emergency measures become permanent, when digital shutdowns become routine governance tools, when constitutionalism becomes negotiable, when accountability becomes selective, normalization not only erodes legitimacy, but normalization destroys the essence of institutions. But normalization makes peace an afterthought. And I want you to get this point because you and I are part of the normalization industry. Because the solidarity for Sudan in Africa hasn't been that strong. I'm sorry. Let me repeat. The solidarity for Sudan and for the Sudanese people in Africa hasn't been that strong. Every once in a while, we send a tweet. Every once in a while, you post on IG, end the war. We are the human rights industry. I am certain there are more than 10,000 people who work on human rights in Africa, and the 10,000 are not showing up. We are not showing up. I am not showing up sufficiently. So as I prepare to land, if I were to reimagine human rights in Africa, this moment demands more than just how we protect the lawyers that are brave and stand up for people who are abused. You know, I appreciate the protection I got from all of you when I was under attack so many years ago. But I also appreciate that this building of movement divas, movement celebrities and gigolos from the legal profession and other profession is something that if we don't address, then we'll never know the real essence of the human rights struggles. Because the elite of labor who actually begin to use formal institutions to defend the oppressed are the ones who become the news, not the people who are oppressed. And I appreciate you do very good work. You are under threat as a journalist. Please, try and avoid being the news. Because it is very tempting to be a headline hugger. And when you hug the headline, the people you were fighting for become a footnote. So when we want to, it's not just about external compliant, periodic reporting exercises, advocacy checklist, and etc. Human rights must be reclaimed as Africa's institutional stabilizer. It was because there was no respect for human rights that we were colonized. It is because there was no respect for our human dignity that we were enslaved. It is because there was no respect for human rights that the genocide against the Tutsi happened in Rwanda. It is because there was no respect for human rights that practices that targeted women across this continent persisted. It is because there was no human rights that corporations felt they could grab land. For victims of genocide, victims of enslavement, victims of corporate impunity, and victims of military abuse, victims of civilian abuse, victims of electoral violence, victims of land dispossession, victims of climate and ecological overreach, must realize the reality of oppression is a system, and a system that's driven by interest. And the reality of the struggle you should fight is this not this fragmentation pushed by donors. That are you the climate justice movement? Are you the freedom of speech movement? Are you the same woman who is not allowed to exercise her freedom of speech is the same woman who cannot gather with others to mobilize. She has no freedom of assembly. Is the same woman who can't get clean drinking water. Is the same woman who's a victim of climate injustice. Is the same woman who's a victim of mining corporate violence. Is the same woman who's a victim of domestic violence and patriarchal violence by people they love. The same girl is abused by the system, abused by the state, abused by politics, but she's not safe in her own home because the likelihood of an uncle, a father, another man in that abusing her is real. So this struggle is not a struggle for us to get more financing for what we do. Desiree asked me to say, we must move from norm production to enforcement. We need enforcement. We need implementation. Documentation is important. Early warning is important. Desiree also asked me to say, Agenda 2063 should be driven by citizens. Something amazing happened at the G20. And I must apologize to my friends in the South African government. I missed the meeting this morning. You see, I went to the G20. The heads of state were going to meet. Heads of state, not just of Africa, of the most powerful countries in the world. Guess what South Africa, the host, insisted on? G20 social. Right? There was a people summit, G20 social. There was a private sector, business 20, parliament 20. And I said, how come this doesn't exist at the African Union? Can I ask that question again? I said, why do we do this for foreign visitors and not do this for ourselves to get a truly holistic conversation amongst business actors, civic actors? There was T20 for the think tanks. Why doesn't this happen ahead of the African Union summit? Why do we do these rituals to impress Europeans, Americans, and everybody else? Why don't we do these things to transform ourselves? If you forget everything I have said, what I wanted to challenge us to think about in this dialogue, please stop talking about which new reports we need to do. Everybody else studies Africa and has a strategy for Africa, 30, 40 years. Everybody else that comes to Africa, not just you are being studied and being paid to study yourself. I need more Africans who are studying all our donor countries, studying their social cleavages, studying their progress, regress, studying where they are going. Look, my friends, you will not become an equal player if you are used to being a recipient of knowledge imperialism. You will not become a human rights space that's transformative if you don't realize that data is the new oil. And data costs to produce.
Everybody that comes to you, gives you a free dinner, a free ticket overseas and elsewhere, is mining you for information. So it is not the gold mines in Johannesburg. It is not the platinum mines in Zimbabwe. It is not the cobalt mines in the Congo that are the source of the greatest illicit flows. It is you sitting in front of me. Because a happy natives with an air ticket and some shopping allowance will give away family secrets and come back with pictures to show it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brian, for that keynote address. And I think it was a reality check, right, that we all needed. A reality check internally, on our continent, externally, a reality check, that was also inspirational. And I think it's a good segue for the sections we're going into in the next few minutes. And I really hope that we take this to heart and we really consider this even as we tackle the different thematic areas and the questions that we had tried to set. Desiree had tried to set, but no, I jest. And so, so we're just going to move very quickly into it. I believe there's a copy of the program on every desk. And the way in which this is going to happen is that we're going to split ourselves into 3 thematic working group for discussions that would happen simultaneously. And so this room we're in is going to be split into 2 with thematic group 1, which is on... let me just get the exact words. Yeah, on human rights, civic space. Human rights and civic space would occupy the first half of this room, and democracy, legitimacy, and constitutional order would occupy the second half of this room. And the last thematic area, which is crisis management and conflict prevention in Africa, would occupy a room just directly opposite the second door. So a third room that will be outside. We have not pre-assigned anyone, so it's really up to you to pick where you want to go. And I think for that purposes, I'll just introduce very quickly our facilitators for each of the thematic areas, so at least you know their face and you know to follow them. So for thematic group 3, that would be in the room just across, we have my colleague Esther Naramugai. Esther, if you can just wave your hand. So you guys are in the other room, as well as Immaculate Liaga. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. I don't know if she's in the room. Okay, she's at the back, and so that's for the group that will be discussing crisis management and conflict prevention in Africa. And then for the second thematic area, which is democracy, legitimacy, and constitutional order, we're facilitated by Jagan Gray Johnson, right here. They would be occupying the second half of this hall. And the first group, which would be tackling human rights and civic space, will be facilitated by Isabel Mwangi, who is over there. They're going to be seated in the first half of this hall. And like I said, so we have the guiding questions, right? But this is really just to kind of give boundaries on the conversations that should happen. We really want to encourage you guys to think even beyond the guiding questions, and what is really most important for us and why this is a dialogue is to get some concrete resolutions, observations, and comments that we can articulate properly and put together for moving this agenda, the 3 different agendas forward. And in that time, or after this time, because we have 1 hour, we are supposed to have more time, but we're really far behind time. So we have 1 hour allocated for this. And so say we start in the next 5 minutes or in the next 8 minutes, 11:30, we should be back here at 12:30 for a plenary discussion where each thematic group can report back on some of the things that they discussed, and then we shall have the closing. Bon? Okay. All right then. Oh.
Just add quickly that the idea is for you to come with 3 to 5 strong recommendations. We really want to put the recommendation together and find a way to get it to policymakers here in Addis. So not too much details, but key 3 to 5 recommendations that can make it to a memorandum that we'll send to the AU Summit before we go. Thank you.
Yeah, and just to quickly acknowledge that we have a few folks who have joined us online, and thank you very much for that. I've been told to instruct the online or the virtual participants that they could come back to the virtual hall in an hour. So yeah, we take the next few minutes to settle into our respective groups, and then we begin. Thank you. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. We have a very important task ahead of us, which is to finish everything in 1 hour. This session is already standing between people and lunch, so we don't want to prolong it any further. And I'm just going to ask that for the 3 thematic groups we had, either the facilitator or the rapporteur come forward here, because what we're going to do is just have we'll take turns, 5 to 10 minutes, just very briefly summarize some of the conversations that was had in the discussions, and also list out some of the recommendations. So it's not a get all down or get all said moment, because all of this is in writing, and I believe the rapporteurs were very efficient in capturing this down. It's more so for the benefit of the rest of the group that was not, or that were not present in the respective thematic discussions, to kind of also get a feel of what was discussed, and if possible have any kind of feedback or further recommendations that they would like to add on to that. So I would like us to use the next 30 or so minutes to do that. So I think if we started with, I think group 1 was Isabel, group 2 was Jagan, and group 3 was Esther and Emma. So either the facilitators or the rapporteurs, or Jagan or Johannes, can come forward. Yeah. Okay, there might not be enough seats up here, so maybe we'll just take turns. So if group 1, Isabel's group, can start us off, or if you guys ready? Okay, yeah, so we start off with group 2. We start with those guys. This one.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Don't dare, good afternoon. So this is group 1, where we're tackling the issue around human rights and civic space. And the question was, are we under pressure? Where do we go from here? And I would want to begin by saying that we did interrogate what civic space means and what is human rights within the African context. And just in summary, is being able to understand that civic space for us, from our conversation, it's a space where we recognize that it's both formal and also it's where people organize differently, what we call informal. But it's a space where it's both formal and where people organize differently. And it happens physically, virtually, financially, socially. And then lastly is that it inhibits from the very low level of our communities, local, national, and globally. And so with that spectrum or understanding of what is civic space, we then went on ahead to interrogate, do our current human rights systems work for us, or what is human rights from an African understanding, where it was very clear that we actually borrowed the narrative that was just brought to us, and that's a narrative we have been advancing, ignoring the fact that for us, in as much as political human rights are important, we forgot what was actually more important to Africans, which was economic and social, which then leads to development and allows us then to engage in other spheres. And so that is where we started our conversation. And when it comes to human rights, for us, we kept saying we want to reimagine what that means and what that looks like. And as we were trying to unpack what our key priorities, 3 things came to mind: that the past is what has shaped the narrative and where we are now. But then as we speak and at this moment, and we're just giving an example of what has just currently happened, maybe 2 months ago, where the US called a few presidents and they went and signed the medical MOU. I even forget what it is called. Compact. Is it called Compact? The Compact MOU. How many people in this country, their president, signed that MOU? I am one of them. So Kenyans, your hand should be up. Which country? Kenya. Oh, wow, Kenyans. Where is Zambia? Is there any Zambian in the room? Your president signed. And we are about to go to help you guys to go to court. Any other country that signed? There were about 15 countries that signed this thing just in this. Which country? Ethiopia. Welcome. We'll start our WhatsApp group for support. But then the three things that happened is, or the three things we must understand now, even as we are reimagining what is human rights and civic space. 1, intellectual property. 2, data. And 3, our genes. Those three things, who is helping us protect them? Because that seems to be the new currency right now with the Western world. If you remember, it's a black woman who was used to be able to shape the issue around obstetric back then, right? That we are back at it again. It's our genes that people want. It is our data that they want. And because we are more intellectual, and I'm saying it with so much pride, Africans are more intellectual. And so they want to be able to understand what information do you have. And then lastly, it's the intellectual property. Who is helping us protect that? And so for us, that has to be included when you're having the conversation around human rights. So our 5 main points in terms of, so what is our key priority moving forward? 1, we need to start shaping the narrative. Far too long we have bought into the narrative. The schools we all went to, we have been indoctrinated in a certain way. We all went and did, perhaps most of us, our masters out there. And then we've come back, and then what? So we continue consuming the same narrative and forgetting that we need to start working for citizens. Yesterday we were having a discussion with Didmas and Don of the model the Center for Human Rights is doing. For most of us who did law, we only learned about the African human rights system when we were doing our masters. Otherwise, at our LLB, oh my God, it was the UN system. It was being able to learn about the precedents that was done in the UK, the common law, yet it does not apply to us. So we must start shaping the narrative. Number 2, it's being able to have a Pan-African mindset when you're having these conversations. And in as much as, and being able to understand that the Renaissance is actually happening now. And that's why the Westerners are actually afraid. There's a renaissance and they can see it. And even as we continue having this Pan-African mindset, we must continue to critique and interrogate the imperial regime that has been happening and the neoliberal regime that we are about to get ourselves into. What does that look like? And so as such, how do we organize for now, but we also organize in aspiration of what is happening in the future? 3, it's resourcing. There's a lot of conversation about resourcing. Everyone is annoyed at their government for getting themselves into loans they don't even understand. But even as we speak about resourcing, 2 things. It will give us independence. It will allow us to shape our narrative. It will allow us to make our own mistakes and learn from them. And then it will also allow us to actually have the Africa that we want. But we must also look globally. What is happening globally? I don't know whether you guys are aware that my country is sending individuals to go fight in Ukraine. To be very honest, I never heard of Ukraine as a country until I saw that it is led by a TV actor. That's when I gained interest. But then now my country seems to have been like, alas, here, and that's why I'm talking about genes and our bodies. Why are we going to fight in Ukraine? Where has Ukraine been globally in terms of when Kenya needs anything? So that's a conversation. When we're talking about resources, for sure we are not closing that space. We also need to look globally, but can we start making new friends? If we are not, and we have made new friends with China, but I don't know, guys, I don't know. So if we make new friends with China, with Russia, can we start defining what that friendship, can we start making contracts? If we get into marriages and we must sign a contract, why don't we sign proper contracts with people we are friends with? So for us, our 4th one was being the right to identity and belonging. I think today morning we have the 6th region, which is the diaspora. So for them, of course, even when they come to Africa, it's the same fight. do we belong here? We look like you guys, we talk like you guys, but do we belong? But in that same breath, when we walk in these different spaces globally, in the continent, are we walking in that room being with the belonging that we actually are there? Do we identify as the leaders that we need to be identifying and carrying the spirit of Africans, the Pan-African spirit? 5, it's our legal frameworks. I think I did speak about this. We need now to start interrogating and making sure our legal frameworks aren't just speaking loudly to political laws, but being able to unpack what it would look like to truly look into the social and economic, which is where we need to be heading to. 6, we had a very big debate about the AU reforms. By show of hand, who knew the AU reforms were happening 4 years ago? Who knew the AU reforms were happening? And I don't want Don's hand, I don't want Brian, I know you've been. Who else, other than the 4 hands, Shiro, please put your hand, as long as you're from Palu. Who else knew 4 years ago AU reforms were happening? Well done, guys, and we are here, well done. So we need to actually start interrogating, not just what's happening in our countries, because the truth of the matter, whatever happens in our national will be done this week. Whatever you're going to hear this coming year, it is all being determined here. So how are we engaging with the AU intentionally and deliberately? The AU reforms happened. We are where we are. Mr. Ruto is the one championing this year. I don't know whether you guys have as much faith with him as we don't. But what would that then look like for us in our own nationals? So we need to be very intent and popularize the agenda of the AU, because this is where the laws come and they trickle down to us. So if we don't get ourselves into these spaces, then how are we helping people who are not aware of this? And when we go back home, can we continue popularizing the AU agenda and making sure it's in the curriculums? Lastly, for us, it's the conversation around intergenerational conversations. There's a whole new, we are talking about Gen Zs right now. They're the people who also need to be in the same spaces. How are we ensuring that the future is aspirational if we are not having intergenerational conversations? And so for us, as we continue to reimagine, we are not just calling it youth anymore because that word has been misused. My president still thinks he's a youth as well. So we are now saying we need now to truly have intergenerational conversations that are going to be positive. Thank you very much.
So yeah, I'm not here to report back. That leadership role is going to Johannes. He's our young leader. But because I was facilitating, to let you know that we're looking at theme 2, democracy, legitimacy, and constitutional order. We stuck to the letter and the spirit of the guiding questions. So thank you for whoever or whichever team put those together. They were very useful. But just to let you know, in terms of our logical methodology that we used was to look at the national challenges and then deliberate around that and proffer some solutions. And then we looked at, obviously, as the question suggests, the regional, but more precisely the continental elements of it, which is the AU and the RECs. And then across all of these is the institutions and the normative frameworks around the African shared values. And then finally, the cross-cutting issues around citizenry participation in all of these things. So again, I'd like to hand over to Johannes to take us through. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So permit me to address this convening while sitting, because I think it's much more comfortable in that sense. So we had conversations upon the 3 guiding questions on theme 2, democracy, legitimacy, and constitutional order. And the first question that we tried to answer is, why are constitutional orders and elections failing to inspire trust? So we already had established a consensus that there is an erosion of trust with regards to constitutional orders and elections. And we did mention a lot of points upon that issue. For example, the increasing tendency to reform constitutions in order to keep incumbents in power. That's the first thing that we just mentioned. We also mentioned that this was to be responsible for the erosion of the legitimacy of constitutional government per se. And also we did mention issues regarding government and institutional capture that could quite result from other actors, and also the inability of different spheres of government to push back against these forms of captures. But when it comes to this particular question, what we have summarized is that there is an existing trust deficit and a lack of confidence with regards to the democratic project and citizen responsibility. And also there is state weakening that we do see, and manipulation of constitutional amendments are prevalent throughout this case. So the other question that we tried to answer in relation to this guiding question is what about the role of or the complicity of the opposition parties with regards to this process? For example, what we have mentioned was that these parties would be constituted of one-man leadership, and they would not provide a viable alternative from the existing incumbency. So there's also an issue of lack of transparency that was mentioned in their governance, as well as other financial management aspects. And with that, we discussed something about the leadership crisis that is prevalent. We have also mentioned that there are transitions. We have noted that there are transitions with regards to the youth generation. This particular youth generation, Gen Zs, have a greater access to social media and other internet platforms, and so they might become more voiceful of their opinions, and they might be they might show their dissatisfaction in a greater extent than other segments of the youth in prior generations. So they might be viewed more as troublemakers than the change makers we want to envision them to be. So the solution that we have provided for this particular aspect is that in line with other attending interventions, we have identified one action point within the AU, which is that electoral governance should be accorded the priority status within this issue that we are discussing so far. And so it must be there must be an aspect of independent electoral supervision in which the financing of this process is actually independent from the member state that's actually being supervised for that process. So that was one of the action points that we suggested. We also suggested urgent reforms on the election governance bodies in accordance to continental and regional norms. With regards to access to information on elections, we have also called for a comprehensive mechanism on transparency and accountability for all relevant stakeholders that participate in electoral governance, including but not limited to pollsters, election regulators, state security apparatus, etc. These were some of the things that we did respond to. So I won't take much time on that guiding question number one, but when it comes to the second guiding question with regards to the AU governance architecture being sufficiently enforced, we have noted different national contexts and also how generalizable they are to the continental context. And we have noted that the rule of strong leadership was actually a very vital component in the earlier interventions of the AU and the legitimacy it had with the public and also other non-state actors. So we did mention that having powerful leaders was a very good was actually a very good catalyst to having the governance architecture. And we also noted that its normative frameworks are well drafted and well designed, but what is lacking is the implementation aspect. And we mentioned issues of ritualization and ceremonialization with the appointment of leaders that would actually incentivize leaders being given the front status from loyalty rather than competence. So one of the things we had addressed a lot of action points on this second guiding question, and we had a lot more deliberation on that. And one thing that we did say was, going straight to the responses, is that we need to operationalize the African Court of Justice. That was one of the solutions that we proposed, and also continue having sustained engagement, communication, and participation with communities, societies, and citizens, and also amplifying the media's role in creating awareness and empowerment of the electoral process within Africa, both pre- and post-election processes as well. And we had a really good conversation and a really good experience that was once mentioned, where in the rural areas where elections were actually being conducted, the citizens would stay on to ensure that the counting was fair and legitimate. So by actually scaling up these practical recommendations throughout the entire continent of Africa, we can ensure that we can rebuild back that trust. So also rejuvenating the African governance architecture, its coordination, and also encouraging cross-pollination of ideas was also one of the action points that we mentioned. And also we discussed a bit on the Malibu Protocol of transforming the Pan-African Parliament into a limited organ, and also suggested that institutional reforms of the AU involve African citizens and communities. So that is what we discussed upon when it comes to the second guiding question. On the third guiding question, which actually addresses the part of how do we shore up citizen participation and also rebuild legitimacy in this process, we did mention that constitutional reforms should be brought forth by citizens, and they should also be proposed by the citizens, and there needs to be a platform where their viewpoints on constitutional reforms will be accommodated. And so we also discussed that there should be appropriate check and balances, even within, for example, a specific government body like the executive branch. There should be an appropriate check and balance instituted, and citizens need to be included within this constitutional reform process. So related to that question, there would be the issue of the disenfranchisement of youth, the frustration and the sense of disempowerment by citizens. So how do we address that to actually improve their participation in democratic governance? And so one of the things that we did mention was the experience that I have mentioned earlier, where our group discussed upon voters actually not just voting, but also defending their vote and overseeing the supervision process. And also a second suggestion within this aspect was organizing misinformation and disinformation alongside access to information. And also we did stress upon the importance of increasing cross-continental solidarity. So this is one of the, these are some of the suggestions that we had with this theme. And I hope I have done the topic justice, if there's anything that I have not addressed.
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to give a brief of what we discussed in Group 3. I feel like Group 2 and 3 more or less said the same things, and you've covered most of them. So in the spaces where you've really discussed some of them, I'll just say the title or at least one or two things which you haven't mentioned. So we were looking at peace and security, focusing on governance failures. And one of the things that we discussed is the fragmented spaces in which both our governance, conflicts, and peace should occur. And one of the things to discuss is, for example, the proxy wars, which you can clearly see in many of our conflicts. We give the example of Sudan. And one of the discussion points there is, even if the national discussions are actually held by, for example, one organization or one institution, there's the danger of having influence from the outside to the two parties which are in Sudan and also to the national. So in terms of fragmented spaces, and maybe also as a recommendation to the African Union, is one of the things to for the African Union to take on more or less like a coordinator father hat kind of like approach in some of these spaces. Second one was diplomatic guardrails. We also discussed the reaction time, and we suggested that the AU is actually operating on a survival mode, more in terms of reacting to the conflict rather than seeing it from the start. And one of the examples we gave was South Sudan. You could see that from South Sudan, even from last year, some of these small, low-intensity kind of like friction coming through, and the election coming up in December is very the probability of a huge conflict in South Sudan is actually high, but the reaction time is actually very low. Of course, cognizant of all the political hurdles that are there still from institutions like the AU and IGAD, their reaction is very, very minimal. You've spoken about leadership, which is also something we brought up, that the Pan-Africanism was more stronger in the last 10 years ago than it is now, and that's actually affecting the unity in the continent. We also did speak about the contradictions and the frictions that exist between the AU, AUC, PSC, and the member states who build up the AU. For example, in elections, for example, you'll see that the AU did give a report saying that elections in a certain country was not fair. And then at the same time, they gave a report, a congratulatory message to the president as well. So that kind of like reaction to the member states who form the AU from the AUC also can affect their implementations and their plans for conflict management, and that creates spoilers within the conflict management kind of like space. We also did speak about dealing with the root causes. As I mentioned, we have more of a reactionary posture, so we focus less on a people-centered like approach, and we focus more on just quieting the wars. Well, there is space and there is need for elite kind of like agreements, and most of the people-centered spaces which build trust and also bring a more long-term kind of like solutions are actually one of the very last things, and even in PCRD, post-conflict reconstruction, they're very undermined. We did speak of contradiction on UCGs, especially from our AU perspective, where suspension happens in certain countries and certain countries it does not. And also we did speak of the challenge of suspensions, where if you do suspend a particular country, but conflict is not confined within borders, so how do you engage the leadership of that same country in terms of conflict or terrorism? Well, they're suspended from the African Union and they're not for example, accountable for anything. So also rules of suspension, where Ruto, in his report for APSA reforms, has agreed that suspension needs to be more strong-handed, but at the same time, we do feel like that kind of like reaction should be relooked, not in terms of making it lenient, but in terms of engagement after the suspension. You've spoken about elections in broad form. I won't go to that. You've also alluded to a bit of border conflict governance, looking at the Sahel and Great Lakes, and those are spaces where the AU can come in strongly. And then you've also spoken about effectiveness of APSA. We did speak about just the knowledge of APSA or any AU instruments, for example, or even organs. I remember a colleague of mine asking me, could you speak to someone in APRM, not knowing that APRM is in their country, in South Africa. So I think that kind of knowledge is also lacking. So one of the things we discussed is that AU should take on a form where it does disseminate its knowledge, its instruments, its policies, its norms, not within countries at a high level, but also at a citizen level. We agree with you. The problem is at an implementation level. For example, the merge between AGA-APSA, which was proposed also by Ruto, we discussed that there is a danger of focusing a little bit more on the security part, but there was also a rebuttal which also pointed out that there is a procedure in terms of reaction to this, which could be short-term, but it should not affect the long-term. So as much as we do react from a security perspective, we should also keep in mind the long-term, more governance, kind of like slow implementation and strengthening of our countries. We spoke largely about resource mobilization, not only at a country level, but also at a AU level, at a staffing level, but also at a is the AU technically capacitated? So even the people who are employed at the AU, are they actually technically capacitated and trained and exposed to this sort of thing for them to have a better implementation plan for their units, for example? Then also a lot of subsidiarity and problem of subsidiarity and less effective complementarity between the AU, REX, and member states was also brought up. I think, oh yes, lastly, which is also I think your last point as well, we did speak up of the importance of CSOs in mobilizing and having slow but effective impact of to the African Union and also their member states. So that's also one of the recommendations we had, that events like this and civil society groups and other groupings which fall under that category can actually have a political impact. Before I forget, and I don't know why I didn't put it on my notes, one of the issues we had, one of the issues we discussed in terms of financing the African Union, which is a huge problem. We did discuss that in terms of financing the AU, member states were told to contribute to the Peace Fund, which is now about 400 million strong, which is very little compared to what is needed. One mission in Somalia takes $1 billion US dollars. So there's a posture of the AU relying on donors, which it's not a problem in itself, but we should also be able to capacitate our own institutions. But one of the things was to have a very strong political outlook and political engagement, yes, and political engagement, so that it can also be a form of economic way of managing our financial situation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much to the respective groups. And I think at this point, okay, we have a few minutes, and I want us all to take ownership of this next session, because we have about 10 minutes for interaction and not a minute more because we're running behind time. So I don't know how we're going to do this. Do we determine that we're taking 3 questions or 3 comments? And that's it, and each speaker gets a maximum of 2 minutes? Or do we just, instead of doing like a Q&A, do we just have it kind of like a discussion where everyone just reflects and comments, and then that's where we can take 5 speakers in 10 minutes with a maximum of 2 minutes each?
Okay, thank you so much. For me, just an emphasis. Donald, if I'm not mistaken, in the morning he said, as an African civil society, we have been very loyal to the donors than to the people that we're actually supposed to serve. And my point is going to reflect on the peace and security, on resolving the problems that are going on in Africa, specifically in Congo, because we're neighbors. If we are going to be speaking about asking for money, that money should not be accountable on the donors, but it has to be specifically, clearly. You're going to resolve a conflict. Show us on that budget that you're requesting, by the end of this quarter, what will be the outcome of the money that you are given? Because we are tired to seeing our neighbors fighting every day and still remaining poor. We are tired to seeing citizens suffering while the money keep coming, and we keep asking for more, whilst very few individuals keep benefiting from this by having big cars, big per diems, and big salaries, while the people who are supposed to serve, they're actually suffering. So as we go out there, as we have it on the paper, I just want it to be very clear, KPI, return of investment. Very clear KPIs, return of investment. The conflict in Congo and Sudan and all these other places, it has to end. And we need to have a specific time frame on when we want it to end. Not for it to be just a political movement where each year we're discussing the same things, but we can really track it and its progress. Thank you.
Jean-Pierre Nzazi. Je suis Jean-Pierre Nzazi, coordonnateur général de l'ACDI et secrétaire exécutif du Rassemblement des acteurs révolutionnaires de la société civile de la République démocratique du Congo. Donc, je viens de la RDC à Kinshasa. Le thème de ce dialogue, droits de l'homme, justice et gouvernance et paix, résonne profondément avec la réalité de la République démocratique du Congo. En RDC, ces notions ne sont pas abstraites. Dans l'est du pays, des millions de personnes vivent encore dans l'insécurité, avec des violations graves des droits humains et une crise humanitaire persistante. La question que nous devons nous poser est la suivante. Comment renforcer les mécanismes africains pour la justice et la paix, pour que la justice et la paix ne soient pas seulement des principes, mais des réalités concrètes pour nos populations. J'ajouterai, pour terminer, excusez-moi, donc la question est de savoir que devons-nous, comment renforcer les mécanismes africains pour que la justice et la paix ne soient pas seulement des principes, mais des réalités concrètes pour nos populations. La RDC est une condition essentielle pour la stabilité de toute la région des Grands Lacs. Elle exige une gouvernance responsable, la lutte contre l'impunité et une coopération régionale sincère. L'Afrique doit démontrer que ses engagements en matière de droits humains et de paix peuvent produire des résultats tangibles. Je vous remercie.
All right, thank you. He's Mr. Jean-Pierre Zanzi from DRC. So he was saying this topic is going very well with the reality that they are facing in DRC. And in the DRC, the humanitarian situation is now crazy, and the situation is going bad every day. And now he is asking himself how to raise the justice and peace principles in Africa to not just be a principle meaning for African Union, but a concrete reality for those communities who are suffering every day. And secondly, he was saying DRC is a strategic country in the region, and for all the region of the biggest lack. So how to make peace and justice become the concrete reality of living for the local community without the international policies. Thank you.
Afternoon. My question is for Team 3 on regard of conflict prevention and management. So, what is your understanding and consideration on Africa's continental organization, which is African Union, and the regional organization in implementing the African solution for the African problem? What we are observing is the problem of understanding or the intracontinental integration and solidarity between African Union and the regional organization in solving the regional casualty on regard of the today's coups d'etats and others. The second one is on the regard of Gen Z movement, right? So what we are observing in African government are trying to escalating the problem through political repression, arresting and suppression, rather than the answering the genuine question or the problem of users, which are the economic problem, unemployment, political representation. Now currently the 70% of the African population are youth. In the world, more than 2.8 billion people are youth. So what are the current measurement of the African government in answering or the Gen Z movement in the Africans digital activism? Thank you.
At this point, I think I'll hand over to Desiree for final remarks, and then he can invite Don as a final speaker.
Thank you very much. So at the beginning, I was saying that we are not in a side meeting. We are in the meeting that is happening because we are citizens of the continent. And the main reason why the OAU became the AU, one of the very main reasons is that they want a people-driven organization. So we can be at the sideline or at the margin of whatever we are in. So today we did something very good. We did something essential. We refuse the silence. We refuse the normalization. So what we're going to do from the report we receive is that we will combine them together into a memorandum of citizens who came in Addis Ababa before the AU summit of head of state starts in 2 days, and we address those recommendations to them. And copy will be sent to the media so that while they are deliberating, they consider what we discuss. And we also were so fortunate to be visited by the Minister of Health of Comoros, who happened to be here. And I was just talking to him, he said, what you are discussing is very essential for the continent, and I'll pass it on to my delegation. So well done, people. So thank you again for the ideas, the proposals. We will put them together, and we will send it to who need to read them. And from now on, again, we will not remain in silence. There's a lot of post-summit activities and action to be made. We will try to create a group of participants, and we'll make sure that you are aware of whatever is planned going forward. Let me now invite the other co-hosts of our events, Don Dea from the Pan-African Lawyers Union, for the closing remark. Don.
Colleagues, let me make this short and sweet. And let me try to go in the end to where we started, towards a rejuvenated and revitalized citizen. Brian Kagoro today started by showing us how the world is changing. But in its changing, it is going back to what it was. So we've had a relatively nice, almost gentle subjugation thing going on over the last 30 years or so after the collapse of the Berlin Wall. But now it is going back to the more violent suppression of 500 years ago, of 300 years ago, of 200 years ago. Brian also told us that we face a challenge, but we also face an opportunity. So perhaps we need new tools to deal with the challenges that we're facing now and convert them into opportunities for now. And we may find that actually just the same way our challenges have gone back to the older form, we may find that while talking of new tools, what we're really required to do is to go back to the old tools and the old ways that those who came before us organized with, that got them out of the situation they were in. I have the happy disposition to be old enough to remember East Africa before the age of the NGO. The NGOs are only 35 years old for most of us. There was organizing before that. The NGO and CSO age, as we have known it, is also rapidly transforming, maybe even coming to an end. For two reasons, for at least two reasons, there could be more. Our governments are developing and have perfected tools of clobbering them into complete oblivion. We're seeing that in Uganda, in Tanzania, in many places, in Zimbabwe, and so on. But also funding and resourcing, as we have known it, is also dramatically shrinking. So we may find that we need to think of new ways of organizing for the world we're heading to, which might actually approximate the old ways of organizing that we came from. In my country, in Kenya, for instance, we had movements, including underground movements. We had the December 12th movement in the 70s. We had Mwakenya in the 80s, and so on. And in this context, where the NGOs, as we know it, are being bludgeoned, as is happening in Uganda, we may find that is what we need to go back to, or at least that is part of the mix, should be part of the mix of going forward. I think the sisters that spoke very well about the need for deft use of technology for coding. I've seen the young people in the country whose passport I carry, Kenya, become very deft at even overnight coming up with apps that help them read through 1,000-page budget documents, that help them collate the ability to send submissions to Parliament in a focused manner, that help them to do online, what we call OSINT, open source investigations online, so that they can identify perpetrators down to their street names, their full name, their spouses' names, their children's names, and so on, and they do their own social shaming of that. So I think we really need to put that in our mind. Brian also challenged us about greater solidarities amongst ourselves. using the example of Sudan. So we really need to challenge ourselves around solidarities across countries, across regions, and even across continents, with other Africans in other continents in the world in which we're going in. And the year of reparations has now been extended to the decade of reparations, has provided for us a very good platform for bridge building with fellow Africans in the Caribbean, in South America, in North America, in Europe, in Asia, that we should harness. Organizing, including new forms of organizing. As I said, I drew a lot of inspiration from the young people of Kenya, Nigeria, Tanzania, and so on, listed in alphabetical order. And while they called themselves leaderless and formless, it is also true that an immense amount of strategizing, planning, financing, logisticizing, troubleshooting, risk management went into what they did in each of these countries. Could this be the new ways? Perhaps what we're called upon, especially the older ones of us who are exiting, is how do we encourage them and motivate them to continue with that and to engage in both short and long term, which they're probably doing anyway. The fact that I don't know about it does not mean it is not happening. So how do we learn from this, encourage ourselves, and develop ourselves towards a rejuvenated and revitalized citizen that will be fit for purpose to deal with the criminals that rule our countries and the world at this time? Thank you and enjoy your lunch.
Thank you very much.